Welcome to the Metabolic Link, a medical and science-focused podcast that explores the common thread of metabolism in health and disease. This is where science meets society. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Metabolic Link. Today, we're going to be doing Journal Club, which is such a fun episode type, if you will, where we dive into scientific papers and really discuss and pick it apart and have a great conversation around what researchers are doing in the field. And, it's a lot of fun to kind of throw things back and forth. So without further ado, though, I'm joined by my fabulous co-hosts, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, Dr. Angela Poff. Hi, guys. So great to see you.
Hey, great to see you.
Yeah. Looking forward to today's topic. We're diving into mental health, which is so important. And it's just really, really exciting, I have to say, to see how much this area of the field is really exploding when it comes to metabolic-based therapies with mental illness and how needed it is, of course, in the world. And I feel like largely in part due to the, Bazookies who've jumped in with their family's personal story with Matt Bazooki, who actually dealt with bipolar disorder for about 5 years. Just a terrible situation over the course of those years, became homeless at one point, and then literally got his life back and went into what he calls remission from his disorder by following a ketogenic diet and a variety of other factors. But through that's really allowed this family to, a lot of families wouldn't do what they've done, but they've taken such a difficult situation in their lives and turned it into funding research. And so we're seeing so many exciting papers and studies coming out of the woodwork, which is great. We've got some, mainstream media coverage that's been happening on NPR and the Today Show. So I really feel like sort of the mental health side of things is moving the needle, when it comes to metabolic-based therapies. Partly, though, too, because it's showing so much promise and so many people are going from these severe, mental illnesses to no longer experiencing hearing voices or, being a contributing member of society again when they literally were isolated inside their homes with schizoaffective disorder or something. So anyway, that's really exciting. I had to just preface it with that because, I'm so looking forward to the research that's coming out. And today we're actually going to be focusing on bipolar disorder and really diving into brain energy metabolism and its potential link to mania specifically. And this paper is titled The Metabolic Overdrive Hypothesis, Hyperglycolysis and Glutaminolysis in Bipolar Mania. And so Dominic, actually, Dr. D'Agostino, is going to break down this paper for us and what it looks like. And then we're going to have a great discussion around it. And so if you are listening to this or watching, please consider sharing this information, because the more we can get this out in the world, hopefully the more metabolic-based therapies will be implemented into practice one day, maybe part of standard of care. So without further ado, Dom, go ahead and take it away on this paper for us.
Great. Well, thanks for the intro, Victoria. And I got the paper here. The paper was sent out by Dr. Iain Campbell, who is the author of the paper, to a group, the Metabolic Psychiatry Group. And we meet every month or so to talk about different topics. And Dr. Harry Campbell are also the authors of this paper. And I think it really captures the essence of metabolic psychiatry in that it ties dietary therapy to metabolic control and also neurotransmitter levels, which the paper goes into, and it's a very innovative new paper that is really kind of focused on neurometabolic mechanisms, pathophysiologically linked to bipolar and bipolar and also epilepsy. So there are many different, overlapping things I'll talk about, when I go through the paper, very similar features. So this particular paper was published in Nature Press Journal in Molecular Psychiatry. And the title of the paper is The Metabolic Overdrive Hypothesis, specifically hyperglycolysis and glutaminolysis in bipolar mania. So the general foundation, concept behind this paper is that there is pretty profound energy dysregulation that is at the root cause of bipolar. It's also at the root cause of different forms of epilepsy. So there are many, similar features that you can kind of talk about with epilepsy and bipolar. For example, it's episodic. So epilepsy and bipolar are episodic neurological diseases. They are both treated with anti-epileptic drugs, believe it or not, especially the manic. Many people with epilepsy and bipolar are treatment resistant. Also, epilepsy and bipolar are associated with much higher glutamate levels in the brain. And we'll talk about why that's the case. For example, if someone has a seizure, the level of glutamate in the brain is like 5-fold higher. So glutamate is the most abundant neurotransmitter in the body and plays an important role in excitation. And another amino acid transmitter would be GABA, or glutamic acid, or gamma aminobutyric acid. So GABA is actually made from glutamate. And there's this balance between glutamate and GABA in neurotransmitter homeostasis. And if you think about it, it's really like amazing that the brain's a massive energy sort of generator. So it sucks up, a large percentage of the fuel that the body consumes, up to 20%, and it's only a small portion of the brain. It's amazing that the brain can maintain energy homeostasis to regulate our mood, right? So everybody has mood fluctuations, but when you have bipolar disorder, these fluctuations are profoundly altered. So there's a biphasic toggling or oscillation, if you will, of the manic stage that is a high energy stage. Also hypomania is another term that's used, which is a little bit lower than mania, where there's high productivity. And then conversely, you have the low energy depression, where patients are akinetic, they don't want to move, they don't want to exercise. If you're in the manic stage, you are very enthusiastic about exercising. You have high mobility, your dopamine levels are really high, and your brain energy is much, much higher. So in a low energy phase, not everybody has it, like about a third of people with bipolar, when they're in the low energy phase, they can become catatonic and literally can't move at all. So this energy dysregulation hypothesis is really sort of, I think the first sentence of the paper kind of encompasses it, or the abstract. Evidence from diverse areas of research, including chronobiology, metabolomics, and magnetic resonance spectroscopy, or MRS, referred to, indicates that energy dysregulation is a central feature of bipolar disorder pathophysiology. And I would say the same thing with seizure disorders too. So like someone, if you tell this to a psychiatrist that energy dysregulation is a central feature, and they make an excellent case in the paper, and it's very well referenced, a central feature of bipolar, they may argue, being a devil's advocate, they may say, well, energy dysregulation, yes, is a central feature because the neurotransmitters, for example, if glutamate's high, then by just the activity of glutamate would necessitate higher brain energy in response to all the action potentials, all the excitation that the glutamate is triggering. So there's this cause, is the bipolar disorder or the mania, or just all the features associated with epilepsy, is it a cause or a consequence of the etiology? And I think this particular paper is very innovative because it kind of lays out the framework that we could have testable hypotheses to understand metabolic control as the root cause of bipolar and epilepsy. So yeah.
Just real quick, I think it's interesting to be, seeing this conversation, which is a very similar conversation that you can read about in very diverse neurological disorders, right?
Mhm.
So even for example, Alzheimer's disease, which is you wouldn't think of as being related to perhaps epilepsy or bipolar. But people are having the same conversation about this dysregulated energy metabolism being a cause or a consequence. It's such a characteristic hallmark of neurological and neurodegenerative disorders across the spectrum. It's really fascinating to see those parallels between what seems to be unrelated conditions.
Yeah, good point. Like, yeah, so when I read this, I feel like you could apply many different diseases that depression, not necessarily even bipolar, where glucose hypometabolism is a hallmark characteristic. And as you mentioned, traumatic brain injury, there's different phases of TBI where there's sort of like a high metabolic state, like right after the injury, and then a low metabolic state, and it's kind of like biphasic. Alzheimer's disease, yeah, it's really classical um, glucose hypometabolism as is a feature of that. So, but it's sort of the discussion with this paper is where is the energy coming from? And the proposal is that there's this hyperglycolysis and glutaminolysis phase that is triggering excess energy in the context of the mania associated with bipolar. And the adult brain energy metabolism, roughly about 90% of brain energy metabolism is coming from mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation or glucose metabolism via the mitochondria. Developmentally, in the fetus and as the brain develops, there's a more like glycolytic phenotype. It could be 20 to 30% of brain energy metabolism is coming from some of the glycolytic pathways. But in the adult brain, the vast majority of energy is, from mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. So what this paper really kind of delves into is mechanistically sort of the root cause of bipolar and in the different phases. So again, bipolar is episodic, it's treated with anti-epileptic drugs, and many of these drugs target glutamate and target GABA. And that's a very prominent hallmark feature of, I guess you could say, glutamate hyperexcitability is a hallmark, feature of all neurodegenerative diseases, neurological diseases, from epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, ALS, Alzheimer's disease, and many other neurological diseases. So keep that in mind. But the biphasic nature is very interesting. And if we could understand the toggle switch, if we can understand what's causing these metabolic oscillations from high energy state to low energy state, then we can get, we can come up with some testable hypotheses to move this forward. And I think that's what's very innovative about this idea and this approach is that it gives us sort of the framework to do that. And the framework of this particular proposal is like proposing that glutamate can serve as a neurometabolite. So glutamate, as is the most ubiquitous abundant neurotransmitter. You hear a lot about dopamine and serotonin and other neurotransmitters and norepinephrine, epinephrine, but glutamate should be talked about more. I teach about it, and it's very it's super interesting because it is by far the most abundant neurotransmitter. It's excitatory, but we don't glutamatergic transmission, or the glutamate receptor, is not super amenable to pharmacological manipulation. So you can't block, for example, the N-methyl D-aspartate receptors or the AMPA receptors. So these are like the primary receptors for glutamate, because if you do, it will stop neurotransmission and you'll quickly die. So a lot of the glutamatergic drugs are targeting the co-agonist, which would be glycine, and sort of altering the function of the glutamate receptor. So just kind of keep that in mind. And glycine will do that, and it has sort of an interesting modulation effect on glutamate. So this particular group, Dr. Iain Campbell published a study, an MRS study on the ketogenic diet, and showed previously that there was, in subjects that were bipolar, they had a 13% decrease in the posterior cingulate cortex. So this was accompanied by a significant correlation between daily ketone levels and improved daily ecological momentary assessments of mood, energy, anxiety, and impulsivity. So these, so the levels, the ketosis levels and being in a state of therapeutic ketosis positively correlated with a reduction in glutamate in the brain. And these were also correlated with symptomatic management.
Our sponsors make this kind of free content possible. So thank you so much for supporting our sponsors by listening to the ads in this episode, because when you support our sponsors, you're supporting the Metabolic Link and helping us make more episodes like this one possible. And I just want to say that we carefully vet every brand that we work with. And if you hear about a product in this episode, it's because we actually use them. So without further ado, this episode is brought to you by Genova Connect. Whether you wake up in the morning not feeling refreshed, or maybe you have an upset stomach after you eat, or you just simply can't put your finger on why you just don't feel good, Genova Connect can help you uncover what's really going on. Powered by Genova Diagnostics, Genova Connect puts the power back in the patient's hands by offering simple at-home advanced lab testing so you can uncover what's happening with your health from the comfort of your own home. This lab is grounded in research, and the team behind it are a group of amazing innovators in health and wellness. So whether it's gut health, hormonal balance, you want to gain nutritional insights, their tests provide clarity and direction along your metabolic health journey, because what we're all after here is really optimizing our health, right? I've actually personally used their Metabolomics Plus test and their GI effects test. Both are just incredible tests that provide so much information, not just, where your levels are at, whether it be microbiome, different forms of bacteria, or it be your nutrient levels, but they actually provide you with actionable items, which I thought was really, really helpful. Things you can actually do to maybe improve your health or work alongside your doctor to improve. I was actually dealing with a chronic illness for a couple of years and used their GI effects test, which really helped me dig into what might be going on with my gut microbiome. And I worked alongside my physician to use that data to then feel as good as I do today, which I'm happy to say I'm through that crazy period of my life. So I really suggest you check them out, because these tests are changing the game when it comes to taking control of your own health. Genova Connect is actually offering 15% off any of their test kits when you use the code Metabolic Link at gdx.net/themetaboliclink. And I know you won't regret doing any of their tests. They will just provide you the information that you need to feel your best. Now back to our episode.
So if we go to figure 1 of the paper, which is really delves into this whole concept, and it looks kind of complicated, but it's actually fairly simple, kind of in theory, is that glycolysis is triggered by impaired mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. So I guess the big question that I have in the paper, and the paper doesn't like directly address this question, but I think it is a central question that is the most important question, is that glycolysis is triggered because there's impaired mitochondrial oxidative metabolism of glucose. But what is suppressing that? What is the bottleneck? So actually, I sent an email to Dr. Campbell last night and asked him that, and I'm going to speculate. I think I can't speak for him because it didn't go too much into detail, but I do think it's one of the most important questions that remains to be answered. But we know things like hypoxia. With the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease, it could be, inflammation, it could be brain blood flow, the glucose, the GLUT3 transporter, which is on neurons. If you're not getting enough glucose in, you have glucose hypometabolism. But one of the enzymes that I think is most important here that was not really talked about, but I think there's an appreciation for it, maybe just because we don't know in the context of bipolar, is pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, or PDH. So PDH can be activated with things like dichloroacetate, which we've used in the lab for cancer. So glucose oxidation, the rate limiting enzyme for glucose oxidation is PDH, and that is acutely impaired with traumatic brain injury and other neurological conditions. So if we open up that pathway, we could activate mitochondrial glucose oxidation, and then not necessarily, in theory, perhaps not trigger this metabolic overdrive of glycolytic activity in the brain that is driving the hypermetabolic state, right? There's some trigger there. And there's many other different regulatory pathways that could be discussed, but the idea is that when glycolysis is triggered from the brain sensing impaired, energy crisis, the glycolysis that's generated, ATP, it's less efficient, but you can generate ATP very, very quickly with glycolysis. And you also generate lactate. And then the lactate, my early work was actually focused on lactate before ketones. And lactate is super interesting because it's a alternative fuel. The brain can use glucose, it can use ketones, and it can use lactate, and maybe lactate even more than ketones, because we exercise, lactate levels can go up to 10 millimolar. That has free access to the brain. It's probably why we feel good. And there's a lot of benefits to lactate, including a robust increase in BDNF. When we exercise, the exercise-induced lactate is probably triggering the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that's BDNF. So the benefits are like linked to the metabolism. Also, if you exercise-induced lactate is linked to enhanced executive function in people. And also, if we infuse lactate, that also increases executive function and different memory, enhancement of memory in people. So just kind of keep that in mind. But in this particular context, there's a compensatory mechanism. Elevated lactate is a compensatory mechanism for impaired mitochondrial oxidative metabolism. So just keep that in mind. It's more of a compensatory. So the main idea, sort of presented is mitodysfunction triggers this hyperglycolysis, and the glycolysis is kind of generated in figure 1. There's astrocytes on the left side and then the neuron. The astrocytes are the source of the anaplerotic. Anaplerotic just means stimulating the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle. So the astrocytes, which are 5 times more abundant, so there's like 5 astrocytes for every neuron in the brain. The astrocytes increase the availability of glutamate to neurons. So the astrocytes, can synthesize the glutamate, and then that could be transmitted. It goes to glutamine, and then the glutamine goes to the neurons. And then through an enzyme, phosphate activated glutaminase, you can convert the glutamine to glutamate. And the idea is that the astrocytes are making glycolysis is activated. So that's, hyperglycolysis. But with glutaminolysis, the astrocytes are sucking up all the presynaptic glutamate that's being released in a manic state and shuttling it to the neurons as a fuel that the glutamate can be incorporated into the TCA cycle and is what we call anaplerotic, right? It stimulates very rapidly in, an increase in energy metabolism. So, the neurons release glutamate, and then they have excitatory amino acid transporters that bring the glutamate back into the neuron. But the main sort of sink and the main way that the brain sucks up all the excess glutamate is the astrocytes. And then the astrocytes convert it to glutamine, and then shuttle it to neurons, and then the neurons convert the glutamine back into glutamate. And in this particular model or hypothesis, the glutamate is entering the TCA cycle, and that's actually stimulating the TCA cycle and the reduced intermediates that drive the electron transport chain too. But it's really just it's focusing on glutaminolysis as sort of stimulating, increased energy in the brain. So this idea then is that you have mitochondrial impairment, hyperglycolysis, and glutaminolysis as the trigger for the mania and hypomania. So a stabilizing influence on metabolism and neurotransmitter systems would be dietary ketosis or therapeutic ketosis, which could be dietary or supplemental, I think was even proposed in the paper. So I think it's generally accepted based on previous literature that this can restore brain energy metabolism and also have a profound effect on the neurotransmitter balance. And I'll get to that, the glutamate and the GABA. But there's also things, I don't think they touched upon it in the review, but there's neuroinflammation that could be suppressed with ketosis too. The NLRP3 inflammasome, IL-1 beta, IL-6, TNF alpha, NF kappa B, like all these things too are and there's another sort of similar review that talked about this too and kind of touched on this glutaminolysis too. But nonetheless, the ketones, then their main function sort of in this hypothesis paper or perspective paper is that beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate are anaplerotic for the TCA cycle. This regenerates the reduced intermediate. It increases NAD levels too, in energetic sort of precursor. Mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation is restored and maintained. And then you have neurotransmitter balance, which I'll get to in a minute, and then a balance of the redox, in the brain, the oxidative reductive things. And there's different antioxidant enzymes too that come into play. So we know from the epilepsy literature that ketone metabolic therapy, that could be diet or even supplemental, increases GABA levels. So GABA, the precursor to GABA is glutamate, and there's two sort of regulatory proteins that convert glutamate to GABA, and that would be glutamic acid decarboxylase GAD65 and 67, and they're located in different parts of the brain. And we know that transcriptional regulation of these enzymes are increased, with dietary ketosis and even supplemental ketosis. We actually did work, and Angela remembers this with Stephanie's work, Charlone, with an Angelman syndrome model showing an increase independent of a ketogenic diet, but with a ketone ester could increase GAD65 and 67, at least in the disease model. So then this idea, the framework of this idea is sort of proposing ketosis as a therapy to circumvent this hyperglycolysis. So the impact of ketosis would affect neurotransmitter systems, similar to epilepsy, and he draws off the epilepsy literature quite a bit because there's just so many common parallels, especially with it being episodic. And then, and also different stressors are triggering it. So in various stressors, the regulatory control of something like pyruvate dehydrogenase is pretty profound. You have insulin, but also a lot of different mechanisms could potentially even acutely impair mitochondrial glucose oxidation. So I suspect that therapeutic ketosis could augment, could work in and of itself, but I think there's also a rationale that therapeutic ketosis, just by establishing brain energy and working to balance neurotransmitter systems, could perhaps even enhance drug resistance persons to the standard of care therapies. So much like I think it does with drugs like Keppra. And I remember attending a conference on this in Belgium, and the pharmaceutical company was interested because the ketogenic diet seems to work really well with this particular anti-epileptic drug. So
using them together could
yeah,
a more effective outcome for people, kind of like what you see or what the research is showing with cancer. Implementing a ketogenic based diet ahead of radiation or chemotherapy might improve the efficacy of some of these standard of care treatments. So using it as something in addition to could be a really powerful combo, it seems like.
Or not a replacement. Yeah,
right.
Because with bipolar disorder, you have, lithium that works. Iain Campbell has written some really interesting reviews on the mechanism of lithium. And I think, that should be, of course, maintained, but there are other drugs, including the anti-epileptic drugs, but also the antipsychotic drugs, in particular, the the atypical antipsychotic drugs have a profound effect on your metabolism and increase insulin resistance. And like Hannah Warren, when we interviewed her, like she gained like 30 pounds, I think. So generally speaking, people put on atypical antipsychotics, which have a little bit of a mild effect than like something like Haldol, but a consequence of that is pretty much in most people pretty high weight gain. So you're starting to, a metabolic therapy would improve insulin resistance, glycemic control, but these antipsychotics, especially the atypical, tend to really dramatically decrease metabolic health. And the idea is that I think these dietary therapies can work really well to get people off the drugs and then titrate the drugs. But I think the message is that, in what I want to convey is that, there's rationale for these therapies to work, but they are not an acute replacement. And you have to, work with your practitioner to titrate the drugs and maybe continue on. I think many people will periodically and symptom episodically need to reintroduce drugs based on the biphasic nature of this, which may not be completely shut off, but managed in a way that makes pharmacotherapy to be far less dependent on pharmacotherapy.
It's pretty simple. Essential nutrients keep our cells healthy. And when our cells are healthy, we're healthy. I'm so excited to share with you that research is showing the essential fatty acid C15 can help us keep our cells healthy by strengthening them, by improving our mitochondrial function, and helping us avoid those damaging free radicals. The result? Better long-term metabolic, liver, and heart health. Fatty 15 co-founder Dr. Stephanie Van Watson actually discovered C15 as the first essential fatty acid to be found in over 90 years. And she did this with the US Navy, where she was actually continually trying to improve the health and welfare of aging dolphins. We actually have a whole episode on it. It's a fascinating story. But what's interesting is that most of us are deficient in C15. I actually was at one point when I took a Genova diagnostics test to uncover that. This results in weaker cells that make less energy and can quit working earlier altogether. All of this makes us age faster, makes us sleep poorly, makes us feel sluggish. Does this sound familiar at all? Well, Fatty 15 is a science-backed, award-winning, vegan-friendly, and pure C15 supplement. By replenishing our cells with that essential C15 nutrient, Fatty 15 effectively repairs our cells and restores our long-term health. Go science! Fatty 15 is on a mission to help you replenish your C15 levels and restore long-term health. You can get an additional 15% off their 90-day subscription starter kit by going to fatty15.com/metabolic link and using the code metabolic link at checkout. That's fatty15.com/metabolic link. Use the code metabolic link at checkout for 15% off. I hope you enjoy. And now back to our episode.
Nonetheless, these are the types of papers that we need to move the field forward, and that the field needs to recognize sort of this idea here.
Yeah. And, you could see a scenario where coupling a metabolic-based dietary intervention, when these pharmaceuticals are on board, potentially helping prevent some of those unwanted metabolic consequences of the medications too. Like it could be a nice way to basically reduce those side effects and potentially, increase efficacy.
You were saying, Dom, that this whole brain energy metabolism dysregulation that you see throughout a variety of neurocognitive issues, Alzheimer's to traumatic brain injury to you name it, right? There's this common theme that is, I think, well accepted as being something legitimate. But why aren't we in this place where, understanding this huge energy deficit, right, in some of these disorders, why aren't we further along yet in terms of using something like a tool like ketosis or the ketogenic diet that has been used for 100 years in epilepsy? Why are we so behind with some of these other conditions? And why is there so much pushback? And honestly, you hear it all the time of families who are facing serious diagnosis, like Alzheimer's or whatever the case may be. where you bring up something like nutrition and it's just kind of looked at as like, this sort of like woo-woo, like, it's probably not going to make a difference. So why would we start that yet? Like, let's, try all these other drugs first. Like, why aren't we further along than that? And why is this not taken more seriously when you're looking at some of these other neurological conditions?
Great question. And I think if you look at the magnetic resonance spectroscopy imaging, what you're looking at, I mean, with pharmacotherapy, it outperforms or has a greater impact. Ketogenic diet outperforms or has a greater impact on brain glutamate levels than pharmacotherapy, which is targeting glutamate and GABA. And I think you can't roll your eyes at that. So there's really elegant brain imaging studies showing, the energy deficit for one thing, but also which could be restored and maintained with ketogenic therapies because you're bypassing the bottleneck of mitochondrial glucose oxidation. And that remains a mystery why that happens. I have sort of my own theories as to why that happens. I want to talk to Iain about that. And I think it actually opens up a lot of testable hypotheses that we can do in the lab and also in human studies too. But I think it's multifactorial, but it's sort of this idea that the general community needs to look at the data and accept and understand that the brain energy metabolism is coming from mitochondrial function and is not necessarily a consequence of elevated glutamate. So they're looking at sort of the consequence and not the root cause. So glutamate's high because mitochondrial function is impaired. You could take a very superficial look at it and say, well, the mitochondria, is it a cause or the consequence? So the brain energy levels are really high in the manic state because you have lots of glutamate, right? So there's a demand-driven process. If the glutamate is hitting the receptor and triggering a membrane potential depolarization, that's going to increase action potential frequency and an increase in overall network excitability. And that will necessitate greater metabolic demands. Hence, your brain energy is going to be higher. So do you understand what I'm talking about? It could be, and then that could ultimately result after the manic phase into like sort of this crash, if you will, of energy and brain resources and a depletion of neurotransmitters. And then that's hence the cyclic nature of this.
Well, you can only imagine, I mean, how much, is required during that manic phase of like trying to like this just dysregulated state, like trying to get back to that. I would imagine homeostasis would be exhausting. It's really interesting though that we're just not talking about the root cause and of sort of these, looking just at something like glutamate, but not talking about the fact that a ketogenic diet can influence these neurotransmitters massively, GABA and glutamate, and maybe help restore balance when somebody's not able to utilize something like glucose as efficiently, their brain, shift gears, provide ketones and see what happens. But it's pretty frustrating. I mean, I know all of us are, really trying to push forward the education piece for medical providers, but it's just frustrating to know that there's a lot of this research that's showing, pretty clearly that there's, of course, this issue amongst a variety of neurological conditions, yet it's not something that's really taken very seriously, I don't think, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And I think it comes down to education. Of course, pharmaceuticals, there's a whole side to it and influence there. But, there's so many people suffering with mental illness right now that with no options, right? Maybe they can't get a therapist because of financial constraints, or maybe they whatever the case may be, they just can't get the care that they need, or they've tried like 40 different antipsychotics or whatever the case may be. It's really frustrating that there's this, nutritional approach in your own kitchen, but nobody is speaking to this except for, of course, the folks in our field that we talk to all the time, where we feel like, oh yeah, this is like, of course. But when you go outside of the field, it's really frustrating to still have conversations where I'm trying to convince people, friends or whomever, who are suffering from things like, Alzheimer's or a mental health condition or whatever the case may be. But me communicating to them that there's this nutrition approach, even when it comes out of my mouth, you almost kind of feel like you're throwing snake oil out there, and people don't think that it actually can be just as effective as some, if not more effective than some of the therapies that these folks have tried already.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And the barrier to entry, I think, barrier to entry and the acceptance of this approach can happen with greater acceptance, I think, if we really talk about bipolar and we compare it to epilepsy, because they're episodic, anti-epileptic drugs are used with antipsychotics, and glutamate and GABA are accepted to be the neurotransmitters that are dysregulated in that. And I think to push this forward, I really think there needs to be, and that's what Iain Campbell's review does. It really kind of presents this idea, and epilepsy is talked quite a bit throughout, that there's really this fundamental mechanism. Of course, it can apply to Alzheimer's disease and stuff too, but I think we have to kind of approach it from that perspective, also approach it from the management perspective that the clinical ketogenic diet is a prescription strength diet that needs to be titrated and controlled. And you got to work with your neurologist or psychiatrist to then adjust the medication, because this bipolar occurs on such a spectrum, and psychiatric diseases occur on such a spectrum, and we all have highs and lows throughout the course of the day, like I do too. And I think like a little bit of this could be going on. So I think for the general person just listening to this that's not bipolar or doesn't have a psychiatric illness, I think the same sort of concepts and framework can apply to just circadian variations or just mood changes that you had throughout the course of a week. I think we could really do ourselves a favor just by improving metabolic health and mitochondrial function. I think there's a lot. I kind of draw back to situations where maybe I had a viral illness and it made me very agitated and almost made me like depressed, and it made me kind of like, and I think that's another question. Another thing is that there are many different microbes that we harbor. It could be, of course, like things like Lyme disease or Borrelia, Epstein-Barr, CMV, herpes simplex, different things.
COVID.
And so many emails from people, COVID, of course. So I get many people email me where like these viral or even bacterial things or even fungal things in some cases were the trigger for a psychiatric illness that has persisted ever since the infection. So I think there's something to that, and a lot of people email me about it. And I think, that's something to unpack too. Maybe we could do another episode on that.
Oh yeah, there's such an influence there. I mean, when I had suffered from long COVID for 2 years, and just going through that virus and feeling the effects on my overall mental well-being during that time, I 100% think it influenced how I was feeling. And honestly, I think if I wasn't on a ketogenic diet or implemented these prolonged fasts along the way, as I did, I do think I would struggle even more with some of the, mental health consequences that come along with some of these sort of massive shifts that these viruses can cause, on metabolism, right? Which can influence sort of brain health overall. And I just think it's really fascinating when you unpack these things and sort of take a look at all of these stories that are coming out now, a lot of anecdotal stuff, but there's a lot of really legitimate science going on with Dr. Campbell, now at Harvard. Really exciting to see mental illness, metabolic therapy being funded in mental illness. But you're hearing all these stories right now Dr. Campbell has a podcast where him and Matt Bazuki speak specifically to bipolar patients, of people with severe mental illnesses, using a ketogenic diet and being able to recover and regain control of their brain, as many of them speak to. So I think this is just the beginning of something really, really exciting, because so many people don't have options right now. So, Angela, were you going to say something?
Oh, I think at one point I was just, I think it's a very complicated situation. And I like to always kind of like, you know, when we talk about why aren't things moving more quickly, it's tough. And I think there's a lot of just inertia in science and medicine. And I think people are very slow to accept new ideas. It's hard to overturn dogma. It's hard to overturn consensus. Or even in a, you know, situation where perhaps there isn't even a specific consensus. Like, I don't think it's agreed upon, like what causes bipolar, but just in general, there's a slowing of people's willingness to accept new ideas. However, I will say I think it has been encouraging to see the speed at which this field has emerged over the past few years, which is encouraging. And I think overall, the general appreciation of metabolic based therapies and the role of nutrition and not just general health kind of prevention, but also actual disease prevention and treatment of disease has really, really grown. And people care about it now. Like, I think a lot of people are, you know, learning on their own, taking it back to their, you know, their healthcare team and having those conversations. Um, and then, you know, just I think that there are very complicated obstacles in fields like this, for example. So, you know, it's been well accepted that ketogenic diet is very effective for refractory pediatric epilepsy for a long time. And it almost like wasn't even really considered an adult refractory epilepsy because of this expectation that adults wouldn't follow the diet.
We're talking about mental health in this episode. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you probably know that we believe metabolic health is mental health. What contributes to better metabolic health? More sleep and less stress. However, many of us are struggling greatly with both. And the wild part is there could be a simple fix to getting 8 hours that you need and also deserve, while also reducing your stress levels. And that is magnesium. 75% of Americans are actually deficient in magnesium. This is a mineral that's essential to hundreds of functions in our body. And that means that there's a 3 out of 4 chance that you're actually deficient. Guess what? Magnesium deficiency is a root cause of a whole host of modern ailments, from anxiety and depression to insomnia and stress. Mellow magnesium is a powerful super blend that contains the 3 most bioavailable and nutrient-dense forms of chelated magnesium on Earth, the 2 most stress-busting aminos, GABA and L-theanine, and over 70 trace minerals. Mellow is truly in a league of its own, offering 300 plus health benefits for better sleep and optimal health and wellness. And they have 4 really delicious flavors. But what I really love about this company is their transparency. Ned shares all of its third-party lab reports, all right there for viewing on their website. You can become the best version of yourself, reduce stress, get more sleep with 15% off Ned products with the code Metabolic Link. You just need to go to helloned.com/metabolic link and enter the code Metabolic Link at checkout. That's HELLONED.com/metabolic link to get 15% off. I hope you enjoy. And now back to our episode.
And that like kids, it works for kids because their parents can control what they're able to eat.
Yeah.
And while obviously that's very like infantilizing and not fair, because there's very clearly like adults that are willing to do this, there is some level of truth to the fact that it's a hard thing to implement and people are not very good at sticking with diets in general. And then also if you're talking about a specific condition where, you know, for example, someone with Alzheimer's disease who's maybe not even fully aware of kind of day-to-day life activities, or perhaps someone cycling between these manic and depressed states and bipolar in that dark moment, how realistic is it? It can happen, right? But I think the field view is like, wow, like we, you know, sometimes it's an uphill battle to get someone to take their medication. So talking about this massive overhaul of their entire lifestyle, their diet, and let's not pretend that the ketogenic diet, if you do it well, is cheap, right? Like that's expensive. You know, there's so many nuances to the conversation that I think in this field we have to really pay attention to and provide just that support that this information needs to be known. And I think offering, like, explored and made available to people, and that's kind of, you know, why we try to do this, because it's not going to be a fit for everyone, obviously. But I think there's a lot more people out there that would be interested if they knew about it. And there's a lot of healthcare practitioners that would also be interested in exploring this in their patients if they had any idea that this was even going on, right?
Yeah.
That this research existed. And so it's why it's so important that people like Dr. Campbell, you know, Metabolic Mind, the people who are doing this kind of work are really advancing the field in such a way that we are seeing that change, even though it's slow and even though it's complicated and there's a lot of ways to improve it. I do think I'm optimistic, really, about what we're seeing and where it's going.
Yeah, no, it is really exciting for sure. I think from somebody not a scientist and looking from the outside in, just in terms of how many people are suffering. Of course, we absolutely need legitimate, solid science behind this, right? But science takes time, and a long time. And some of these folks that are out there don't have time to wait, right? And I think that's where Metabolic Mind it's so exciting to see what they're doing, because they see also the value in being able to train, you know, educate other psychiatrists out there, because I think there's like a handful, right? There's so few psychiatrists, psychologists that are actually implementing metabolic-based therapies right now, because the science, of course, isn't super robust. But there's so few dietitians who can even implement these metabolic therapies as well, that they're overloaded. I mean, I've recently have reached out to several dietitians in the field, and many of them are just bandwidth is non-existent. But you know, it's exciting to see the field move forward. But I think that the more information we can get out there, the more we can educate providers to hopefully implement this based on what we know so far, especially in cases where you've got like resistant psychiatric conditions to pharmaceuticals, where everything has literally failed for people. Considering making even just like whole food shifts, right? Not even like a full-blown ketogenic diet. I was talking recently to Beth Supek Kenya, actually on our podcast, about some of the work that she's been doing with Metabolic Mind and research with mental illness. And she was finding that you don't even have to go on a hardcore, you know, ketogenic diet at like a 4-to-1 maybe, or even a 3-to-1, 2-to-1 ratio, right? Fat to protein plus carbohydrates for something like epilepsy. You don't have to be that rigid with somebody. What she's, you know, at least, of course, they've not published these results yet, but what she's seeing is there doesn't have to be that extreme specific macronutrient count and weighing food and all of those things with mental illness. So what she's finding so far, which is really exciting, because if you could just give somebody a handout, you know, and had different categories of protein, fat, carbs, try to stick with this, eat till you're satiated. And it didn't have to be so, just as intense as I know it is for epileptic patients, and trying to get ketones at a certain level, because that actually can help, people avoid seizures and what have you. Knowing that you don't have to go to that level with something like mental illness, I think, and make strides towards just even many of these people, I think, just with, eating whole foods might be seeing some of the benefits of, getting off of inflammatory oils and all of these other things that they're not even realizing that they're, gluten and what have you, that they're consuming, that some of these small changes could make a difference is really exciting. That maybe it doesn't have to be, even though there are similarities between, epilepsy and certain mental health conditions, just in terms of brain energy metabolism, maybe the approach doesn't have to be as daunting as I think it is for a lot of providers looking at something like epilepsy versus mental illness. And if you could just make a few small changes, tweaks to your nutrition. Granted, I hear what you're saying, Angela, about if you're in the throes of a psychotic episode or, mania or whatever the case may be, thinking about changing your nutrition is probably the last thing on your mind. Or if you're somebody who's experiencing cognitive decline and isn't themselves, or has the ability to take care of themselves, or even with something like cancer, right? Dealing with any of these conditions, you grappling with an initial diagnosis, the grief that comes along with that. you have to meet people where they're at. But anyway, that was a tangent, but just to say, I'm excited to hear and see that maybe even small changes in nutrition could help people suffering right now in a variety of areas. So it's good to see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll end there.
Well, I'd like to add, like, final thing is
Yes,
that
please, Dom.
metabolic psychiatry needs to be commercialized, right? So, I'm not like an entrepreneur or whatever, but if there's entrepreneurs that are just entering this field and they're very interested in kind of helping this field, if I was a registered dietitian, I would want to, do my standard training, but then gravitate towards metabolic psychiatry because you will not have a lack of people that will want your services. If you are a company that could specialize in whole foods based ketogenic meals, even a 1-to-1 ratio, which would be like a low carb diet, 50 grams a day, what Denise Potter does is simply just, 3 or 4 low carb meals a day and just add 2 tablespoons of MCT to each meal. And then it's a ketogenic meal. She has therapeutic ketosis with that. And a 1-to-1 ketogenic diet, you could pretty much eat anywhere, even if you're eating out. So I would like to sort of like inspire, have an entrepreneurial spirit, just kind of throw that out there for people in the space, because we need diet therapies, we need consultants, we need well-formulated, tested ketogenic ketone supplement therapies. I think there's just a lot of potential for innovation here, and also in the monitoring.
Yeah.
So I'll soon be testing a continuous ketone monitor, and I think that this could be a really viable, important technology for managing diet compliance and diet efficacy. So using continuous lactate, continuous ketone, and continuous glucose monitor, something I'll be doing soon. So, and I think these off-the-shelf technologies can be applied. And also, we didn't talk about sleep, and we didn't talk about exercise, but I know sleep and exercise are also key to mental health, and that's a whole nother conversation we could have. But
yeah, super important factors though. And honestly, to go back to Matt Bizuki, he also credits some of these other influential, practices that he, from sunlight to sleep to community to, there's so many pieces to the puzzle of mental health, not just diet, but it's really exciting to see how influential diet can be. And, papers like this highlighting the need for more work in this area for sure, and more communication around it too. So for those of you who are listening and maybe enjoyed this podcast episode and this dive, we'll be sure to include the paper in the copy of the podcast, but please share this with your friends. There's so many people out there. It's highly likely yourself or maybe somebody you love is dealing with mental illness. And this might benefit them to understand some of the similarities to, brain energy metabolism with bipolar and things like epilepsy or what have you. So please share, like, comment, subscribe, all the things. And of course, stay tuned because we're going to be coming out with more journal clubs down the line. And thanks so much to you both for the great fun discussion on this paper. Excited for the next one.
Yeah, super important paper and really inspired by the innovation and the thought of both Dr. Campbell's, Iain and Harry Campbell. So I want to thank them for their contribution to science.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, guys. We'll see you guys soon. Thanks for watching and listening to the Metabolic Link.
Do you love learning about metabolic health? So do we. It's why we created the Metabolic Initiative, an online educational platform providing evidence-based education on metabolic health and therapies for healthcare professionals and the general public. By joining the Metabolic Initiative, you'll gain access to hundreds of expert lectures, interviews, panel discussions, and even private episodes of the Metabolic Link. CMEs are available. Go to metabolicinitiative.com to get started. And as always, thank you for listening to the Metabolic Link.